My Lords, it's a great pleasure to follow the Noble Lord, Lord Best, as always extremely incisive and clear on our all too often tragically awful housing and general building sector. And I would very much wish to associate myself with his remarks about transparency, which of course extend the need to ensure that and not allow commercial confidentiality to overcome it, extends far beyond the housing sector. I declare my position as Vice President of the Local Government Association, and of course it's a great challenge to be second last of the backbench speakers, not to repeat, and I shall seek not to do that. So I'll begin by associating myself entirely with the comments of the Noble Baroness Young of Old Scone and the Noble Lady Baroness Parmenter, who covered many of the issues your Lordship's House may expect me as a Green to cover. And I think perhaps it's fortunate that I land at this particular spot on the list, because mine might be described in chunks at least as a balancing speech to that of the Noble Lord, Lord Boylan. Because I think we have to start looking at this bill at the disastrous history of government, of outsourcing of government services over the past decades. And I'm not being specifically party political or only looking at one side of your Lordship's House here. There was some acknowledgement of this in a government press release on the 6th of December 2021, which said it was its efforts would be seeking to, quote, exclude companies with a track record of poor delivery, fraud or corruption, close quote, from winning public contracts. To pick more or less at random a few of the worst offenders, if you want a wider selection, just pick up any date of private eye and you'll find many more. Let's start with Serco, fined £22.9 million in a settlement with the Serious Fraud Office over its electronic tagging contract. That was a deal through which it dodged criminal charges. Capita, with its £1.3 billion contract for army recruitment that missed every target for recruiting both regulars and reserves, in some years by 45%, and never in a decade by less than 21%. Yep. Or arguably the worst offender of all, G4S, which advertises itself as the leading global integrated security company with more than 500,000, mostly lowly paid employees around the world, and a human rights record to rival a failed state. It was profiting from running Birmingham Jail until it spectacularly lost control, due, the Independent Monitoring Board suggested, to insufficient staffing levels and quality. One job ad put out by G4S said, quote, there were no specific previous qualifications or experience required, close quote, to be a prison custody officer. The state's highly trained officers had to come to the rescue when G4S had lost control. It also, of course, had the contract for Medway Secure Training Centre, housing some of the most vulnerable children in the country, also Rainsbrook Secure Training Centre, both of which contracts had to be taken off for absolute failure. So it's very clear that this bill is to be welcome, and indeed that's what we've heard in this debate, welcoming this bill from probably all round this House, except perhaps from the Noble Lord of Moylan. I think it's worth going back to something that lots of people said, though. The government and the Noble Lord the Minister in his introduction claimed that this is part of the much-famed, much-celebrated Brexit dividend. Although, of course, as I'll come back to, many other members of the European Union seem to have managed without the continual stream of outsourcing disasters involving multinational companies that we've had, under exactly the same set of EU rules. But let's start from where we are now and make this bill as good as possible. And for that, I think we really need some clarity. And I think it's really important to stress that Clause 18, which talks about most advantageous tender in a competitive tendering process, this is not actually new. It's already possible under current regulations and guidance. And this will not, bringing in something that already exists is not going to change culture and practice. The concern, as many Noble Lords have expressed, that value for money equals lowest unit cost. So there has to be focus on social value, environmental value, economic value in particularly our disadvantaged communities. And there has to be, and the government says they wish to achieve this, opening up to small and medium enterprises, away from these disastrous failed multinationals. who are great at being cash cows and terrible at delivering services. And on that point, I would particularly associate my comments with myself with the comments of the Noble Lord, Lord Mendelssohn, and indeed Noble Lord Thomas of Glenleith, that the idea that a small and medium enterprise can, in dealing with a big organisation, got a contract that's gone wrong, can use civil remedies for that, can take them to the courts, is just clearly utterly impractical, and we need something else. And I think we also need to really look, and I think we need to look very closely at the 30 days payments regime and the way it's expressed in the bill and whether that's strong enough. Now, I want to note the useful briefing from the Local Government Association, which notes, as the Green Party often does, that so many apparently cheap things have been costing us dear in this low-wage economy, the lack of investment in training and skills, and the environmental damage. There is, however, I think I would acknowledge as a Green, something of a philosophical problem here for me, in that this is trying to set some rules from Westminster that apply around England and Wales, at least. But I think Green philosophy shows a way forward here. What we need to have in this bill is a foundation of basic standards, while allowing freedom for councils and other commissioning bodies to choose higher employment, environmental service standards. And I note the call from the Local Government Association for national funding for the upskilling of council procurement officers. We all know how stretched local government is, so I do have a specific question to the Noble Lord the Minister. Does the government intend to provide resources to local councils to ensure that they are able to work with this significant change as the government outlines in this bill? Now, I note also, just in passing, a number of useful briefings that have stressed very much the importance of getting away from the multinationals, from the Social Enterprise UK, from CODEC, the Coalition for a Digital Economy, the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, and the National Association for Voluntary and Community Action. I note also a very useful briefing from Unison, which says what we need is inclusive, high-quality, sustainable public services. And those are not just about procurement, they are also, of course, about decent funding. Now, a couple of specific points I'd like to make about the detail. Schedule 7 and Schedule 6, I would suggest, need to be combined. Schedule 6 has the mandatory exclusion grounds, which include conviction for corporate manslaughter or corporate homicide, fraud, bribery, slavering and human trafficking, organised crime, and tax offences. Well, I'm glad they're regarded as exclusions. That's a good place to start, and I think we have to look at some of the contracts set over recent years and see that doesn't seem to have been applied. But if we look at Schedule 7, which is the discretionary exclusionary grounds, this includes labour market misconduct, environmental misconduct, competition infringements, or professional misconduct. Surely they should also exclude bidders. And maybe if that means that all of the bidders are excluded, which is perhaps not unlikely given the tale of woe with which I started, well, maybe we need to get to a contract specification to cater for a different sort of bidder, a social enterprise, or indeed a public body constituted for the purpose of delivering that service or goods. And more, and I cycle back here to where I started, and I warn Noble Lords, this is where I get to my most controversial bit. Really. I note that all of my case studies, and perhaps they were not entirely randomly selected, are in the exercise of the coercive power of the state. I would say that whether it's in prisons, courts, policing, or the military, the exercise of those grave responsibilities, the literal power in the worst cases over life and death, and certainly the power over individual liberty, they should not be contracts for which the government hands over responsibility. They should remain in government hands. And I will be talking to the Bill Office to see if there's a way we can bring that into this bill. So I'm going to finish. I've been mostly negative, and I always like to be hopeful. So I'm going to circle back to the points raised by the Noble Lady Baroness Young and Baroness Parmenter. and indeed the noble Lord Maud, who said, can we get the heart racing about public procurement? Well, absolutely I can, and indeed I can point to the fact that back in October 2019, the first written questions I put down in your Lordship's house as a new baby peer of a few days, I think it was, were about public procurement. I asked the government how much organic and local food was being bought for schools, hospitals and prisons. I think noble lords who've been around a lot longer than I will probably know the answer I got to each of those questions, which is the government doesn't know. Exactly right. So I come here to a point that for the second day in a row, maybe the noble Lady Baroness Noakes and I can agree, which is the question of impact assessment. And I can't see anything in this bill, and it is a very long and complex bill, and I'm not a legal expert reading all of those pages, where we have an impact assessment of what this bill does in, say, 2 years' time, of how it's changed public procurement to improve public health, to improve economic situation of disadvantaged areas, to improve the state of our environment, to cut our carbon emissions or to improve our natural world. So how are we going to see the impacts of this bill? A question I leave your Lordship's house with.
Well done.